Hey everyone. All right, in this video, we are going to talk about how to make your pressure graph for your radiosonde data for our layers of the atmosphere lab. So this week, we are investigating the atmosphere and we are looking at some raw data from a radiosonde, which is just a weather balloon. So that's a technology device that is launched into the atmosphere and it takes readings of different atmospheric things. So it can look at pressure, it can look at wind, it can look at temperature, it can look at composition, it can do all sorts of things. So for this particular lab, we're going to be focusing on altitude and how, when the altitude changes, how does that affect the pressure? And then how does that affect the temperature? And how are there any changes in composition? Remember that composition is just what something is made of. So the atmosphere itself, the air, is not just one thing, right? It's nitrogen, oxygen, argon, carbon dioxide, carbon monoxide, methane, ozone. We've got all these different things in the atmosphere. And if you go up to different altitudes, you actually get different combinations of those things. So this lab is going to help you kind of look into that. And the first thing we need to do was looking at this data is to make it a little bit more reasonable. So we're looking at this beautiful data table. But one of the easiest ways to see trends in data is to graph it. So that's what this video is about. So hopefully you clicked on here for the pressure graph video. The next video we'll watch is the temperature graph video, but we're going to look at our altitude and pressure. So anytime you're making a graph in, I was going to say Microsoft Excel, but this is not Excel, it's Google Sheets. You want to click and drag over the information you want to graph. So notice I clicked on altitude and then I grabbed it and held it down until I highlighted all of the information I wanted. Now I'm going to go up to insert and I'm going to insert a chart. So that's all the way down here, boom, chart. And the first thing it's going to do is it's going to pop up a beautiful line graph, which we do want a line graph, but this is not exactly what we want. So in this video, I'm going to show you how to change this so that it looks nice and neat, so it's easy to interpret. So first of all, our axes are something we need to change. Right now we have pressure on our y-axis and altitude on our x-axis. Now this isn't entirely wrong. Our altitude is our independent variable. However, for the ease of interpreting this, we're going to flip this so that our altitude is going up. That way, as you look at this graph, you'll see how it changes as a change in altitude goes up. So what we need to do is we need to switch our axes. To do that, in this edit area, we're going to switch our x-axis with our series. Anytime you see the word series, it's asking you, what do you want on the y-axis? So first I'm going to start with the x-axis, altitude. If I click on it, it's going to automatically be like, do you want to use pressure? Yeah, I do. So I'm going to click on pressure. You'll see this snaps into a straight line, and that's because pressure is on both axes right now. So now I go to series, and I'm going to click altitude. And just like that, I have my altitude on the y-axis and my pressure on the x-axis. Now it's kind of hard to understand that because my titles are now super wrong, right? I can tell by the numbers that this is definitely talking about my altitude going up here because if you remember, our pressure started over 1,000. So that means it's got to be my x-axis right now. So I'm going to show you how to change these things, these titles, and we do that by going up here to customize. So click on customize. We're going to skip chart style for now. If you want to go back and play with that, you can. Just make sure I can read your graph. We're going to look at chart and axis titles. So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to, instead of chart title, and I'll show you where I clicked on that, instead of chart title, I want my horizontal axis title. So I'm going to click on that. Right now it says altitude, but remember we swapped this. This is pressure. So I'm going to get rid of altitude. I'm going to put in pressure in millibars. Whenever you're making your titles, don't forget to use your units. I know we haven't talked about millibars yet in class. We're actually going to do that this week, but millibars is the unit we use to measure pressure in our atmosphere. Now you can see my title down here for my x-axis has changed. I actually like bolding it and italicizing it. It's a personal preference. Do what you want. You can change the title color here as well. That's completely up to you, but it should say pressure millibars for the horizontal axis title. Now I'm going to change my vertical axis title, right? Because it currently says pressure and they can't both be pressure. That'd be crazy. So I'm going to erase that. I'm going to put in altitude in kilometers because that's what our weather balloon did as it went up in the atmosphere, is it measured the pressure every 5 kilometers. So that's why we have that unit. Again, I'm going to bold and italicize. Now I'm definitely going to go to my chart title. My chart title isn't terrible. It says pressure in millibars versus altitude in kilometers. And that's right, but that's not really descriptive enough for anybody reading my graph to really understand what is in there, right? So I'm going to change my chart title to pressure change with altitude in Earth's atmosphere. Now that is specific enough where anybody looking at this graph will know exactly what we're talking about. Is we're talking about how the pressure changes with altitude, right? I have my independent and dependent variables there, but I'm also saying where we are seeing this pressure change with altitude. This could easily be something that's happening on Mars, Neptune, Uranus, Pluto. I need more information, so that's why I added it to my title. Now, again, I like to bold and italicize. I'm actually going to center this bad boy. And I'm a big fan of changing the title color, just make it pop a little bit. Again, that's not something you have to do, but it is something you could do. So that is our chart and axis titles. Now looking at this graph, this isn't too bad. I'm going to change my dimensions a little bit just so that it is a little bit easier to see how it changes with altitude. I'm going to make it a little bit taller. So now it's a lot easier to see this trend, whereas it was kind of squished before. And I'm actually going to change my scale too. So 0, 25, 50, like that's fine, but I actually want to know what these smaller hash marks are. So you might find that you could go to your horizontal axis and your vertical axis. And if you do that, you are going to find your scale factor down here. But that's not the easiest place to change your grid lines. We're actually going to go all the way down to grid lines and ticks. Go ahead and click on that. And we're going to change our steps. So instead of step counting, we're going to go up by, oh wait, no, step is what we want. Step is what we want. This is asking what we want our increments to be, like how much we want to count up by. And our radiosonde counted up by 5. So we're going to do the same thing. We're going to put 5 in there. Now this does make our axis a little bit, a little bit more busy, but it's a lot easier to see the information and where it goes for each of those increments that our radiosonde measured. So that's why we added that major spacing, which is just asking what do we want our increments to be on that y-axis. If I wanted to change it for my x-axis for pressure, I would click on horizontal axis, and maybe I want to change by, let's say, 100. Boom. And now I can see how that pressure changes. Now, again, I like that we have more numbers down there. I think it's a lot easier to see. It's not something you have to do for every graph, but for this one in particular, it's going to make it a little bit easier. So that's why we did that for this video. And now, if there's anything else you want to change about your chart style, you can change the background color, the font, the chart border. You can play with these things here, but your overall graph should have these grid lines. It should have altitude on the y-axis, pressure on the x-axis, and it should have this sweet title up here so that we know what we're looking at. So that is how you make your pressure graph for this lab. If you have any questions, reach out to Ms. Berg or a classmate and enjoy.